Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining. Welcome to this webinar on pitfalls to avoid when implementing continuous delivery at enterprise level. So you might be wondering, so that's an interesting topic because it's always good to learn from mistakes and then not doing everything by yourself. So let's get started. A bit about me. I work as a technical consultant at Devon. So Devon is a technology consulting company. We are based out of Netherlands. We also have offices in Germany, India, and a satellite office in UK. So we are, so to say, international company. I am a trainer from scrum.org. I give trainings on professional Scrum developer course and PSM and PSPO. And I'm also a trainer from Microsoft. I teach all ALM and TFS related topics. And I also help enterprises implement continuous delivery. I currently live in Netherlands for past 3 years, working with major financial organizations here, helping them with their DevOps journey and implementing CI/CD in those organizations. You can reach me via Twitter at any given point of time. My Twitter handle is mentioned here. It's a funny BCA. So I'm more than happy to take any questions, maybe during this webinar or later. I have my colleague Lisa with me, who is moderating this webinar. So if you have any questions, feel free to type in, so I'll get them via Lisa, and I'll try to answer as many as I can in the given time. All right, okay, so let's get started. It's the reason why I chose this topic is so some wise man basically said that life is too short to make all mistakes by yourself, and of course one of the key benefit by making mistakes is that you get to learn from it, but in today's day and age in a business, you really can't afford to make too many mistakes, so you can learn. So the best thing is to learn from each other. So that's the main intention of this webinar, is to share some of the pitfalls that I encountered while working with large enterprises implementing CI/CD, and my lessons from it, and hopefully that will help you to speed up your journey or to avoid those pitfalls. So before we start, let's set some a common base ground, because different definitions, every organization have their own interpretation of this terminology of what CI or continuous integration means, continuous delivery or deployment. So for me, for this talk, my base is, for me, a continuous integration is when some code change happens, when a developer check-ins some code into a version control system, then there is a build available. So for me, that I qualify as continuous integration. Of course, there are some quality gateways, like your unit tests and code cyclometric complexity are basically static code analysis and those kind of things. So different quality gates are there, but for me, in general, continuous integration means check-in, results, a build. Continuous delivery, on other hand, a code commit, if every quality gateway passes, then we should have a shippable product. So basically, we have a product where we are just waiting for someone to push a button, so those changes can be deployed to production. So for me, that's the definition of continuous delivery. So in an ideal world, so that someone would be a business owner who would choose what features will go to production at what time. And continuous deployment, the way I see it, any code change that happens, if it passes all quality gateways, it ends up in production without any manual intervention. So that's the basis I come from, and the difference between continuous delivery and deployment for me is whether it's completely automated or is it some manual intervention required, not for any other purpose but basically to decide at what time you want to go to production. So that's where continuous delivery stands. All right. So if you actually notice, the theme of this webinar is pitfalls when implementing continuous delivery at an enterprise. So why is enterprise so different? Before I go into that, let's try to understand what are some common pitfalls do you see while implementing continuous delivery. So some of the pitfalls that I've seen are things like development teams using a shared database during development. So that leads to there is one central database, every developer making changes are connecting with, to the same database. So at times it results, so somebody tries to change a column, but then that change is not promoted to other people, then people have to stop, get the latest, those kind of things. Other challenges could be something like how your application code is structured. I've seen some instances where there is one Git repo or one repository where different applications are bundled. So every time there is a build trigger, then the whole multiple applications get built, and then it takes enormous amount of time. Or things like ignoring failed builds, not having proper notification when build fails, or even if there are notifications, none of the team members looking at those interventions. Not keeping everything in version control or using wrong tooling, like for example, since we have licenses for UFT, let's use UFT to automate every type of test, or we have licenses from IBM Rational Workbench, so let's use that to do all sort of testing. So these are some of the pitfalls that I see. However, the theme of this webinar, I'm not going to discuss any of these, because these are more on implementing on how you work or develop or progress with implementing a pipeline, development practices, and also the whole notion of engineering excellence. So that, in my opinion, is same whether you are working for a small organization or a medium or an enterprise. The focus of this webinar is what kind of unique challenges that you might encounter when you are trying to implement continuous delivery at an enterprise. So why are enterprises different? Well, enterprises are different because they are more complex because of the sheer size, the volume of operations, the number of systems they have, the diversity of tooling, and more importantly, a lot of enterprises usually work with a lot of distributed teams. That adds additional complexity when you want to implement continuous delivery. So because of these various reasons, implementing continuous delivery in a small or a medium organization compared to enterprise poses different set of challenges. I'm not discarding the previous challenges we discussed in terms of engineering excellence, the right practices, and so those are still valid, but I want to focus more on what are those unique things that most probably you might see at enterprises. Basically, my experience, as I said, from past 3 years, I'm working with major financial institutions in Netherlands, and all my experiences I've drawn from my past 3 years working at large enterprises. Before that, I was working at small to medium enterprises. There, the challenges are bit different when you deal with enterprises. So let's look at some of my mistakes that I've seen in past 3 years. There are actually quite a lot. So as you could see, well, apparently I made too many mistakes, I guess. But the thing is, yeah, of course, you learn from them. But the key thing, so in the given time, I don't think I would be able to touch on all these things. But on a high level, as you could see, some of them, the teams still not focusing on done. Let's say every Scrum team, they have something called definition of done. However, their definition of done ends when we are in QA or in staging or whatever. Done means going into production. So this is one of the critical thing. A lot of teams in enterprise, they cannot achieve this because of whatever existing processes or the compliance issues or whatever that is. So that is a problem with not having a done increment. Even though team is meeting a definition of done, but does your definition of done really include moving to production? I have not seen any team so far, let me put it like that. And I'm not going to go through all of them. However, what I'm going to do in this webinar is talk a little bit more in detail on these three major pitfalls that I see, because these are things that I see almost every customer that I work with, that these are the three usual suspects, so to say, that stand out. First one, lack of business alignment. Well, let me ask you this question. How many of you think IT is a cost center? If you actually talk to a lot of enterprises, they even today consider IT as a cost center. I mean, it's something that incurs some cost, but our real business is banking, our real business is airline, our real business is their whatever they perceive as a core business. But if you actually look at it, now every industry or every domain, the core of their operations are all IT centric. How good or how best you can leverage market purely depends on how well are your IT systems. Let me ask you a simple question. Let's say Google. Do you think IT is their core business, or do you think it's their a cost center? Do you think for Facebook, IT is their core business or a cost center, or for Twitter? So I'm sure most of you might think yes, for these companies, yes, IT is their core business. I mean, their engineering excellence and the innovation that they do with their software products, that's their core business. Yeah, that's true. But let me ask you a question. So for a bank, let's say for example ING, what do you think is their core business? Banking? If you actually listen to their CIO, Ron Van Caminada, who appeared in a lot of public conferences, and when I was working as a consultant there, helping with their DevOps journey, so it was a clear message from CIO that we are a IT company having to have, I mean, just happen to have a banking license. So the reason why that message is clearly sent out within the organization, and it was also said across multiple public platforms. So there are really nice, interesting videos available in YouTube. So how the ING transformation, in fact, that's one of the biggest transformation I was part of, which I'm really proud, because the kind of progress that they made was phenomenal. In fact, they are looked upon as one of the example cases how a financial institution who are known to be more conservative could implement radical changes with whole DevOps and CI and CD. So the point I want to make is, any business, it doesn't matter whether you're in banking, automobile, transportation, it doesn't matter. The core business is how well your IT systems function, how flexible and how fast can they adapt and deliver value. Now, having said that, lot of organizations still do not consider that. They still think their core business area is something else, and then IT is just a cost center. In such instances, the key problems, what challenges that you might encounter? The first and foremost, budget. Who should pay for it? Should business pay for it, or should IT pay for it? So in all my assignments, this was a never-ending discussion. Who should pay for it? Where do we get time from it? So in the end, with one of the business stakeholder, we said, of course you have to explain all the benefits of CA and CD, but end of the day people will ask, am I going to get new features? Maybe not today, but maybe in a long run things will be faster, but that sometimes it's hard to sell. And IT is always, the IT department was always pushing back, but hey, this is not something that we should pay for it. But think about it, if you save some cost because you became faster, or you improved your quality, or the maintenance days have gone down, or the number of defects have gone down, or whatever, who is going to get benefit out of it? So if as an IT department, if you say that, hey, you know what, once we become better, then we are going to charge less to business, then it's a different story. However, if you say no, that's not going to happen, so that's the discussion that you need to have. So the pitfall number 1 in terms of business alignment, who should pay for it? So make sure that you have a clear expectation on that. So think about from an aspect that if things improve, who is going to benefit from it? Is business or IT? If you are charging back to business, will that change? Are you going to change that? So those are the aspects that you need to consider. The second part of it is time. As you know, business is always under constant pressure that we need features like yesterday. However, you see more often that in order to focus more on delivering features, the always trade-off the trade-off that is taken is not focusing on improvements. So it's like this: how much time you want to spend on chopping trees, and how much time you want to spend on sharpening your axe. So that is always a trade-off. So make sure you align with your business on that aspect. So this is another pitfall that we constantly encountered. One is the budget, who should pay for it, and the other one is time. So do we get enough time? The way we solve this problem is we made explicit agreements with the business that every sprint X percentage of time will be spent on CI and CD activities. So looks like we have a question.
Yeah, and I'm not even sure if it's a question or maybe a challenge to you, because I hear Jerry is saying here that he's not sure if he is agreeing that for banking IT is core business, because in the end the bank does not deliver IT to the end user. IT services are used to deliver banking products to the end user, better, faster, etc. And maybe you can share your thoughts on that.
Okay, excellent. So it's an interesting discussion, because the reason why I say that is because if you look at the new European regulations which changed a couple of years back, that now banks are expected to provide their customer information to other parties, of course when customer agrees. So this actually opened up immense opportunities for the small players or niche players, but at the same time it put the banking domain in a position where it is not any more protected kind of a model, because now tomorrow Google can come and with their very specific offering, if I am willing to share my data with a provider, because of the new regulation now bank is obligated to do that. When I ask my bank to share all my financial information with a party, they are obligated to do that. Then the banking services, you don't need a bank to carry out. So if you look at the kind of changes that are happening in recent past, the things like the different payment models that have come in, the things like the whole PSD2 that is coming in, so with different wallets that are coming in, so like mobile wallets and things like that. So the position how the banks were perceived in the financial sector a couple of years back, now they no longer enjoy the same status, and in near future things are going to change even more. So if as a bank, if you do not adapt or react to changing environment faster, then the immense competition will obviously take the market share. So it's not a protected so to say environment which banks used to enjoy a couple of years back because of all these regulations and things like that. So from that point of view, that's why I say for any business, IT is really core of from their business model. There is a really interesting article that was published in Harvard Business School called "Software is Eating the World." So I'm sure that will give you even more better insights why IT is now the enabler, and it is at the center of every business strategy of every organization. So I encourage you to also look at that article, which might give you a little bit more insight, so from where I am coming from and why, at least in Netherlands, if I look at major financial institutions, everyone are investing heavily on IT, because they see them as an enabler, and also they see as a game changer in terms of getting the competitive edge in the market by responding fast and being more flexible in terms of delivering what is needed. Yeah, I hope that answers. Since I have a couple more topics to cover, I want to continue from this, but if you have more questions, feel free to put it in the chat window and I'll try to answer them. So those were the things that I wanted to focus more on, the business alignment. So this is one of the most critical thing. Every time that I see, this acts as a major variable in terms of how successful CI/CD implementation in an enterprise goes, because of if you do not have right alignment with business, that becomes extremely hard to implement. There is always this notion in the IT that implementing CI/CD is a technical thing. No, it is not a technical thing, because you are doing to basically to impact your overall business flow. So that's why it is extremely important to align with business and bring them on board sooner. Moving on, the second pitfall that I want to talk about, which I encounter a lot, is lack of growth culture and mindset. What do I mean by that? Especially some of these organizations that I work with, there are people who are working there for, I don't know, maybe 20 years, 30 years, and they are more or less established their standard way of working. When you try to work in more agile way, which is bit different than what they are used to, I have seen considerable level of resistance that comes in with this change. What is it to do with implementing CI/CD? At least the place where I am coming from, I see implementing CI/CD, of course, implementing tools and pipelines and development practices is definitely a part of it, but the major part is also how people react to the existing changes to the new process, and how are they going to look at the new feedback loops that are the result of implementing new tools and practices. Couple of things, when you try to work in a DevOps team, after a while it becomes extremely difficult if a person is only an expert in one field. I am not suggesting that every person in a DevOps should have expertise in different fields or should be an expert in different fields. That's not what I am saying, even though that is extremely desirable. However, the ideal situation to go is to have some sort of a T-shaped model. So this is one of the things that we do, that we encountered initially, that when we started with one of my previous customers, that there was a development team and operations, and we said, okay, so we have to start with a DevOps approach, and we changed the organization structure and brought in some operations and development people together, and they were working. But immediately we figured out that then, even though people are working in a team, but they are not working as a team, because everything is individual sprints, everyone is working in their individual silos, and that was not really helping to trigger the kind of collective code ownership that we were looking for, the sense of accountability that we were expecting from the team. So what did we do? So we worked closely with the HR of the organization to sort of define some growth plans. In another term, we defined some sort of a T-shaped skill matrix for the workforce. So in a nutshell, what it boiled down to is, it said, hey, today you are an expert in field A or field B or field C. That's great. However, from next 1 or 2 years, depending on the amount of time those people spent in the organization, together with HR, we defined that in next 1 or 2 years you also need to gain expertise in maybe test automation, or maybe in Python programming, or maybe something whatever was relevant for that team. And from an organization point of view, we also supported with the training, time, whatever budget that was required, but the idea was after that 1 or 2 years this person also sort of picks up additional skills. So that's the T-shaped skill model. The other thing that we did to encourage this whole growth culture and the growth mindset was to establish some rhythm in the organization. So we started something called Tech Thursdays, which means every Thursday the whole day the team spends on doing something, learning something, and experimenting things. We started doing some hackathons every quarter. So these are some things that we did to sort of trigger the whole engineering culture. So the focus is more on the engineering excellence, the focus is more on constantly focusing on the growth, on expanding the technical skills, and also being able to scale more on a T-shaped model, not only expert in one field. So I see one more question from Lisa.
Yes, we have a question from Don Tempson, and he's asking what a company should do if they hear about CI/CD for the very first time. Should they try to implement it right away, or which 3 steps would you advise?
Excellent question. So if you are new to CI/CD, my 3 things. Number 1, try to plot your current landscape. What do I mean by that? So try to have a visualization of how your current value stream looks like. So start from when there is an idea that comes in. I assume, I don't know whether you are already doing or working in a Scrum way of working or in an Agile way. If not, so try to see when do you get initial requirement and what steps that requirement has to go through before it ends up in production. Typically, usually it falls down into 9 steps. You gather requirements, you do some analysis, you do some design, you do some coding, you do testing, you ensure, you create some documentation, you do some checks, and finally go to production. So these are typical steps. However, what I would encourage in this whole stream is to plot against timeline. How much time or what activities you had to do analysis, or what was the output of your design. So likewise, you plot the whole thing. That's step number 1. Step number 2, identify what are those manual tasks that you have to do every time. It could be every time before I go to production, I have to do manual testing or regression testing. Every time I have to go to production, I have to prepare a lengthy report, or I have to create a run book to hand it over to operations team, or whatever that is. So identify what are those bottlenecks or the things that consume a lot of time, and that's step number 2. Step number 3, identify your quick wins. So how do you do that? Number 1, for example, if you could change to bring operations people to work closely with development team, I'm not saying change your organization structure and become a DevOps team. That's not what I'm saying, because I don't really know your organization context. If possible, at least try to involve the operations guys sooner, so they not only look at the run book but also see what actually development team is already doing upfront. Try to automate. So if you do not have any automation and all your testing is manual, I highly suggest go with some functional test automation. Even though on a long run you should try to focus more from a unit test level to integration and then functional, but as a quick win, try to focus more on a black box testing. And so other low hanging fruit could be using a common repository, making sure that there is a common source code repository, and set up a continuous integration. Not with all the quality gateways maybe, but at least to start with, every time there is a change of code, then at least a build gets triggered. How many checks you do in the build, that you can constantly increase, but make sure that your code is in a code repository and your developers start checking in code sooner. So once you have these things in place, you have a good starting point. Then the second part of it, the pitfall that we discussed just now, make sure you get the business alignment. So talk to your business, explain them the business, the importance of it, and also talk about the kind of impact. Remember, implementing continuous delivery in an enterprise is not cheap. It is not a cheap thing. So it needs a lot of time, effort, money. So make sure you get your business on board. So these are some things that I recommend you to start with, and this will hopefully give you enough items which will trigger for your constant improvement. And if you are doing, or if you are already working in an agile way, so I am sure you have some sort of retrospectives or something like that. If not, if you are still working in a traditional way, still I encourage you to sit with the people from business and the teams who are implementing at least once a month to see what could be the next improvement. Come up with that roadmap. Always try to look back at your end-to-end flow that you defined and see what could be the next step that you could add. Yeah. So hopefully these are some of the things that you could focus on. All right. So moving on. So having that growth culture, so that is extremely important. So always having that buzz in the organization. Otherwise, okay, we implemented CI, we have some tools, but after a while it sort of dies down. There is a build that is failed, no one really looks at it. Every time before we go to before we deploy to staging, or then we carry out huge amount of tests, then we get feedback too late and those kind of things. So that's more from a process, but how people approach, so that mindset, focusing on that is extremely important. So that was the second pitfall. Moving on to the third pitfall, which is for this webinar, this I want to make it last one, underestimating the impact of continuous delivery. As I just discussed, implementing continuous delivery is not cheap. It's not only cheap, but it is also extremely difficult, not only from a technical point of view, but also from the organization process point of view, also between alignment between different departments, their governance structure. So many things would come into picture. So be prepared to deal with those situations. In one of my earlier assignments, we made an initial plan that, okay, so continuous integration, let's set up this tool, let's have this let's have an orchestration tool, let's use this framework for testing, blah blah blah. So we defined that, but very quickly we realized that you encounter so many problems that you don't foresee. For example, so we defined an initial backlog, so based on the approach that I just described, so plotting out the end-to-end flow and identify the low-hanging fruit, and we defined a sort of a roadmap. And when we started implementing CI, we quickly ran into an issue that we wanted to do some functional automation testing, and we wanted a new environment for that. To procure those servers, it took almost 6 weeks to procure one server. Not because team was able to do functional, they were able to already create functional testing, they were able to improve their CI infrastructure. However, to procure new servers, it took more time. And in some cases, we had to open a firewall port because of the regulations or the compliance issues in the organization. It took enormous amount of time, and we wanted to use a package. To get that package on our build server, every small bit and pieces, we used to hit so many roadblocks because the existing organization policies, the existing IT rules, they were limiting us to really work in agile way. So be prepared that implementing CI/CD, you touch upon so many areas within the organization where you might hit in so many roadblocks. So how did we solve this? In one of the organizations that I'm currently working with, the management really made a bold decision to solve this by adapting by deciding to use public cloud as their hosting provider. Well, was it an easy change? No, it almost took 1 year for us to certify this cloud provider to to be compliant with our organization standards. However, now that we have, so every team now they are able to create infrastructure as code, and they are able to spin up new machines whenever they need and then throw them off and able to keep up with it. So that's why the impact of CD not just is something that you cannot deal with only within the team or within the department. It touches maybe perhaps risk, your compliancy, your business, and sometimes it could also touch upon different regulatory requirements. So be prepared for it, and that's where plotting your existing end-to-end process flow would already help you to identify what are those areas which you want to focus more. So these are the three main pitfalls that I wanted to discuss in this webinar, and I'm sure there are a bunch of other ones which you have seen in your experience, and there are other things perhaps which I would like to discuss some other time, but I'm curious if you have any more questions, and you can always reach me on my Twitter handle and these slides will also be available, and you could also watch this video recording at a later point of time also, which will be available via YouTube. Do we have any more questions, Lisa?
I do have a question myself actually. It wasn't asked in the chat, but I hear a lot about money and management, but also about culture, and I'm curious as to how you see it. Would you recommend it being implemented top down or bottom up?
Oh, that's an excellent question. How do you implement continuous delivery? So I've seen both situations. For example, in one of my assignments, so the management or the architecture group together with the project leadership of this CI/CD implementation project, they defined the tool set. Of course, they looked at some existing teams. They defined, okay, so this is what our tool going to be for version control, this is what it is going to be for our orchestration tool or a build tool or test automation tool, etc., etc. However, we quickly ran into a challenge that teams were complaining, we want to do, but we are so special, but this cannot work. But then we had to spend so much time and energy in basically explaining, okay, why this is the right tool or wrong tool. However, on the other hand, it is also a main problem that I see, that if you let teams to completely self-organize themselves, then they use all sort of tools. I've seen some teams started using some open source tool which was developed somewhere in South America with only one contributor. Well, I don't know how secure that is to be used in a financial sector, but then there is always that balance. So at least what worked best for us was we defined a pool of tools. For example, for version control system, you could use either GitLab or you could use VSTS. It's up to you. Use any of those, but you have to choose from only those two options. For testing, you could use Selenium, you could use UFT, or you could use IBM Rational Workbench. That's it, nothing else. If you have a really valid case, then please come to us, convince us, then we add. So the best approach that worked for us is it's a mix of both top down and bottom up. So from a top down, you provide enough options for the teams and let team has that freedom and flexibility to pick whatever works best for them. Yeah.
Yeah, two more questions by Jerry. Let's start with the first. That is, he sees a big challenge prioritizing activities across different teams. Do you also see this challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. So especially when you implement continuous delivery at an enterprise, unlike small or medium organizations where the end-to-end value stream is defined by one or two applications, which is typically owned by one or two teams. When you move to enterprise level, to deliver end-to-end value, or basically your value stream consists of different application blocks, and in some cases one application block itself could have, let's say, 4 or 5 different Scrum teams working for one application block. So it is extremely important to have that alignment when you want to go to production, because let me take a hypothetical example. Let's say you are working on a mortgage app. So in order to implement a feature, you need to make some changes to your CRM, because that's where you get some customer data. And then there is another part of application which does some credit checks, which is handled by a different department. And then there is some other department which does customer facing, like a portal application or whatever. In order to build one functionality, these 3 different application blocks have to come together. Now, how do you make it happen? The way I have seen best work is in 2 parts. Number 1, from a business or a process point of view, it is extremely important for business owners or the product owners, so to say, to have a clear alignment on this. How it is done, it is purely organization dependent. So every organization figures out their own way, but the bottom line is it is extremely important to have that alignment, to make sure that the business is aligned and have those priorities in place. Now, what does it mean for technical teams? A couple of things. You need to have certain practices in place. One of the main thing that I have seen extremely useful is something called end-to-end testing. It is important to have test automation at your building block level, which is quite useful to give you feedback all the way from granular unit test to all the way to the functional thing. But the more important thing is to have your end-to-end flow, which is when you tie all these application blocks together, do you have a mechanism to run through the whole end-to-end test? For example, if I trigger a money transfer now, it goes to other bank, it debits, and then I get an acknowledgement, and finally I see an email or something in my account, for example. So do you have a test case which touches on all these different building blocks, and how do you maintain test data for this such a long running or a scenario which runs across multiple blocks? The other thing is, do you have right environments so where you could test this functionality? So that's second thing. The third aspect to consider is the diversity of your continuous delivery pipelines. So that's also one pitfall that I did not discuss today, is in enterprises, if you do not have a proper control, so to say, it is really easy to end up with numerous deployment pipelines. That will pose a lot of challenges. So to having that alignment of pipelines among different building blocks also is quite important when you work in such a situation. So I would say these are top 3 things that you need to consider when you work in an enterprise where multiple building blocks have to come together.
Yeah, what Jerry also suggests is that some scalable agile model would become very necessary, such as SAFe perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said, so implementing continuous delivery is not only from a tooling or a technology point of view, but the process also dictates heavily on how successful your implementation can be. It could be SAFe, it could be Nexus, it could be any other model, but the key thing is, do you have a mechanism where you have a better or a very close alignment with business? Do you have a mechanism where you get feedback loop much tighter and smaller, feedback loop within your team, feedback loop across your teams, and feedback loop across your different building blocks? Do you have such a mechanism? Maybe, for example, SAFe has a release train with a rhythm and things like that. For Nexus, it is something else. For every process is different. And so to sum it up, yes, absolutely, you need to also focus on the process, on the requirement flow, on how you promote from idea to production. The whole process need to be looked at. So you need to have a whole systems view, not only an isolated team view or application view.
Thank you.
All right. So thank you for joining for this webinar. Watch out for this space. We will be publishing more webinars every month on different topics. Do sign up for our upcoming webinars. Thank you. Have a good day.